He saw her before he saw anything else. Not her face, not her expression, not even the quiet confidence in the way she carried herself. What he saw first was her skin, her clothes, the way she stood slightly apart from the rest of the room, and in a split second, his mind filled in the blanks with a story he never questioned. It was automatic, almost effortless, like a habit he had practiced so many times he no longer noticed he was doing it. To him, she fit a role he had already written long before she walked through that door. There was no pause, no curiosity, no moment where he considered that he might be wrong. Just a quick judgment, sealed and certain. In his world, people like her didn't come in with purpose, didn't carry authority, didn't belong anywhere near decisions or discussions that mattered. They were background, invisible until needed for something small, something menial, something that reinforced the quiet hierarchy he believed in without ever saying out loud. And so, without asking a single question, he acted on that belief. It wasn't just about one moment or one decision. It was built on years of quiet assumptions stacking on top of each other, shaping how he saw the world and the people in it. Every time he chose not to listen, every time he dismissed someone based on what he thought he knew, it made the next judgment easier, faster, more confident. By the time she stood in front of him, he wasn't thinking at all. He was reacting from a script written by bias, reinforced by experience, and never challenged by reflection. To him, it felt normal, reasonable even. He might have told himself he was just being practical, that he could read people quickly, that he had a sense for who belonged and who didn't. But what he called instinct was really assumption, and what he called efficiency was a refusal to see beyond the surface. She didn't speak right away, and that silence only confirmed what he already believed. He mistook her calm for uncertainty, her stillness for submission, her patience for a lack of purpose. He didn't consider that she might be observing him just as carefully, that she might understand exactly what was happening in that moment. Instead, he filled the silence with his own certainty, stepping forward with the kind of authority that leaves no room for question. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It didn't need to be. It was quiet, controlled, and rooted in the belief that he was right. That belief had been built over time, shaped by a system that rarely challenged him and a perspective that had gone untested for far too long. In that moment, he didn't see a person. He saw a role, a place, a limit, and he placed her inside it without hesitation. What made it more dangerous was how ordinary it felt to him. There was no sense that he was crossing a line or making a mistake. It was just another interaction, another quick decision in a long line of similar choices. That's how assumption works when it goes unchecked. It becomes invisible to the person making it, even as it shapes everything around them. It narrows their view, reduces complexity into something simple and manageable, and strips away the possibility that they might be wrong. He didn't think about her background, her reasons for being there, or the possibility that she carried something far beyond what he could see. He didn't imagine that she might hold authority of her own, or knowledge, or experience that could challenge his. Those possibilities didn't exist in the version of the story he had already decided was true. And so he moved forward, confident and unaware, guided by a belief system that had never forced him to stop and question itself, completely certain that he understood exactly who she was the moment he saw her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Authority, when it's worn long enough, settles into the way a person stands, the way they look at others, the way they give instructions as if they're facts rather than choices. When he picked up that mop and held it out to her, it wasn't a request. It wasn't even framed as a suggestion. It was an expectation, delivered with quiet certainty, backed by the uniform he wore and the power that came with it. In his mind, there was no line being crossed. This was simply how things worked. He had the power to assign, to direct, to decide who did what, and he used it without hesitation. But what made that moment heavier than it seemed was not just the act itself, but the reasoning behind it. He didn't hand her the mop because of a need or a task that required attention. He handed it to her because he believed she belonged in that role, because he felt entitled to place her there, because he assumed she had no authority to question him. That's where authority shifts into something else, something quieter, but far more damaging. It becomes less about maintaining order and more about reinforcing control, less about responsibility and more about dominance. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't check if she worked there, if she had business there, if she even had any connection to the place at all. The decision was made entirely on his terms, based on nothing but his perception and the confidence that no one would challenge him. And that confidence wasn't random. It came from a system that had, time and time again, allowed him to act this way without consequence. Small moments like this had likely happened before, unnoticed or unspoken, each one reinforcing the idea that his authority could extend wherever he decided it should. It's easy for power to stretch like that when it isn't questioned, when it isn't held in check by awareness or accountability. What starts as a role defined by duty can slowly blur into something personal, something shaped by bias and assumption rather than fairness or respect. In that moment, the badge on his chest didn't just represent his job. It became a shield for his behavior, a way to justify actions that had nothing to do with his actual responsibilities. He might have believed he was simply keeping things in order, making use of the people around him. But there's a difference between leadership and control, and he had crossed it without realizing. True authority listens before it acts. It verifies before it assumes. It understands that power is not a free pass to decide someone else's place. But he skipped all of that. He moved straight to action, driven by a certainty that his position made him right by default. That's what makes abuse of authority so subtle at times. It doesn't always look like aggression or force. Sometimes it looks like a simple gesture, a small command, something that can be brushed off as routine if no one stops to question it. But beneath that surface is a pattern, a way of thinking that places one person above another without reason, that uses position as a tool to enforce belief rather than responsibility. She stood there, facing him, and in that moment, he expected compliance. Not because he had earned it, not because he had explained anything, but because he believed it was owed to him. That expectation reveals more than the action itself. It shows how deeply rooted his sense of control had become, how natural it felt for him to direct someone he knew nothing about. There was no hesitation, no second thought, no awareness that he might be misusing the authority he carried. And that's what gives the moment its weight. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of a mindset, one that had been shaped over time and left unchecked for far too long, one that blurred the line between duty and dominance until he no longer saw the difference. She didn't correct him. Not right away. She didn't rush to explain who she was or why she was there. Instead, she let the moment sit, almost as if she understood something he didn't. While he moved with certainty, she remained still, composed, watching him with a calm that didn't match the role he had placed on her. That calm wasn't hesitation. It wasn't confusion. It was control, the kind that comes from knowing more than you reveal. Hidden identity isn't always about disguise or secrecy in the obvious sense. Sometimes it's about being underestimated, about carrying something significant beneath a surface that others dismiss too quickly. In that moment, she held that advantage without saying a word. He believed he understood her, believed he had already figured out her place, but what he didn't realize was that his assumption had blinded him. It kept him from seeing the details that didn't fit his narrative, the quiet confidence in her posture, the lack of urgency to respond, the subtle awareness in her eyes. Power doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always arrive with noise or recognition. Sometimes it walks into a room quietly and lets others reveal themselves first. She allowed him to speak, to act, to show exactly who he was in that moment, all while holding back the truth of who she was. That kind of restraint is its own form of strength. It requires patience, an understanding that timing matters, that revealing everything too soon would change the outcome before it fully unfolds. There's a difference between having power and needing to prove it. He operated from a place where authority had to be visible, reinforced through action and control. She operated from a place where power could remain unseen until it needed to be acknowledged. That contrast created a tension in the air, even if he couldn't feel it yet. To him, the situation was simple, already decided. To her, it was still unfolding. Hidden identity often challenges the assumptions people rely on to make sense of the world. It exposes how quickly perception can replace reality, how easily someone can be misread when they are judged by appearance alone. She didn't fit the image he expected, and instead of questioning that, he forced her into it. What he failed to see was that her silence wasn't agreement. It was observation. She was watching how far he would go, how confident he would remain, how deeply rooted his assumptions really were. There was a quiet shift happening beneath the surface, one that hadn't reached him yet. He still believed he was in control, still believed he understood the situation completely. But control built on misunderstanding is fragile. It only holds as long as the truth stays hidden. And she was the one holding that truth. There was something deliberate in the way she carried herself, something that suggested she had been in situations like this before, moments where she was underestimated, misjudged, placed into roles that didn't belong to her. Instead of reacting immediately, she let those moments play out, let people reveal their thinking, their bias, their limits. It gave her clarity. It gave her insight. And in this case, it was giving her something more. The space to let his authority stretch just far enough to expose its weakness. He didn't notice the details because he wasn't looking for them. He saw what he expected to see, nothing more. But hidden beneath that surface was a different reality, one that didn't match his assumptions at all. She wasn't who he thought she was. She didn't belong to the role he had assigned her. And the longer he held on to that belief, the more unprepared he became for what was coming next. Power, when it's hidden, has a way of shifting the balance without warning. It waits for the right moment, the exact point where certainty is strongest, where assumptions feel the most secure. And then it reveals itself, not just to correct the misunderstanding, but to expose how easily it was created in the first place. The moment didn't announce itself with noise or movement. It arrived quietly, almost unnoticed at first, like a small detail that didn't seem important until it suddenly was. As she reached out, her sleeve shifted just enough, just slightly, the kind of movement no one plans and no one expects to matter. But it did, because in that brief second, something became visible. A mark that didn't belong to the version of her he had already decided was true. A black viper, coiled with precision, sharp and unmistakable. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was a signal, a symbol, something loaded with meaning that he recognized instantly. And that recognition hit him before he had time to process it. His body reacted first. The confidence that had carried him just moments ago faltered, interrupted by a sudden pause that he couldn't hide. His hand, still extended with the mop, hesitated. His posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, but enough to break the illusion of control he had been holding on to. That was the turning point. Not loud, not dramatic in the way people expect, but powerful in its stillness. Everything changed in that space between seeing and understanding. Because now, the story he had created no longer fit. The role he had assigned her didn't make sense anymore. And for the first time since she walked in, doubt entered his mind. It moved quickly, unraveling the certainty he had relied on, forcing him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the situation. The tattoo wasn't just unexpected. It contradicted him. It challenged the foundation of his assumption in a way that couldn't be ignored or explained away. He knew what it represented, or at least enough to understand that it carried weight far beyond what he had imagined. That symbol didn't belong to someone insignificant. It didn't belong to someone he could dismiss or direct without consequence. And in that realization, his authority began to shrink, not because anyone took it from him, but because it had been built on something unstable from the start. His mind raced to catch up, trying to make sense of the contradiction, trying to reconcile the image he had formed with the reality now in front of him. But there was no smooth transition between those 2 points. Just a sudden shift, sharp and undeniable. The room didn't change, but the atmosphere did. It was subtle, almost intangible, yet impossible to ignore. The energy that had once supported his confidence now turned uncertain, leaving him exposed in a way he hadn't anticipated. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to explain or clarify. The reveal had already done the work. It had interrupted his control, dismantled his assumption, and forced him into a position he wasn't prepared for. That's what makes a true turning point. It doesn't rely on volume or force. It relies on timing, on contrast, on the sudden collision between belief and reality. He had been so sure, so certain of his place and hers, that he never considered the possibility of being wrong. And now, in a single moment, that certainty was gone, replaced by hesitation, by awareness, by the uncomfortable realization that he had misjudged not just the situation, but the person standing in front of him. The tattoo became more than just an image. It became a mirror, reflecting back his own mistake, his own bias, his own failure to see beyond the surface. And there was no way to look away from it. Not now. Not after it had been seen. The power dynamic shifted without a word being spoken, without any direct challenge or confrontation. It happened internally, within him, as he struggled to adjust to a reality he hadn't expected. And that struggle showed, even in the smallest ways, in the pause of his movement, in the change in his expression, in the quiet loss of the certainty he had carried so easily just moments before. The shift didn't end with that moment. It lingered, settling into the space between them, pressing against everything he had just done. Once the certainty was gone, something else took its place. Awareness. Not the kind that comes slowly, but the kind that arrives all at once, heavy and impossible to ignore. He couldn't go back to what he had been just seconds earlier. The version of himself that acted without question, without hesitation, without doubt, had already been exposed. And now, every movement, every thought, carried the weight of that realization. Consequences don't always come in loud, immediate reactions. Sometimes they unfold quietly, starting from within. His mind began to replay the moment, not as it felt at the time, but as it actually was. The assumption, the command, the certainty. Each part now looked different under the light of what he had just discovered. What once felt normal now felt misplaced. What once felt justified now felt fragile. That's the first layer of consequence, the internal shift that forces a person to see their own actions from a different angle. It's uncomfortable because it removes the protection of ignorance. He could no longer tell himself he didn't know. The evidence was right in front of him, undeniable. But consequences don't stop at awareness. They move outward, into the space where actions meet accountability. The authority he had used so freely now stood on unstable ground. It wasn't just about what he had done, but how it reflected on him, on his judgment, on his ability to carry the responsibility that came with his position. Authority demands trust, and trust depends on fairness, on awareness, on the ability to see clearly without letting bias interfere. In that moment, he had failed in all of those areas. And failure like that doesn't disappear just because it's recognized. It stays, shaping how others see you, how you see yourself, how future decisions are made. Even if no one else had noticed, even if the room remained quiet, the impact was already there. But moments like this rarely stay contained. They ripple. They create tension, not just between individuals, but within the structure that allowed the situation to happen in the first place. If one person can act on assumption without question, it raises a larger issue about the environment that supports that behavior. Accountability isn't just personal. It's systemic. It asks how something like this could happen so easily, why it felt acceptable, why it went unchallenged until now. For him, the realization brought more than discomfort. It brought a loss of control, not in a dramatic sense, but in a subtle, internal way. The control he thought he had was tied to certainty, to the belief that he understood the people around him. Once that belief cracked, everything built on top of it became unstable. He had to reconsider not just this moment, but the pattern behind it. How many times had he done something similar without noticing? How many times had he relied on the same assumptions, the same quick judgments, the same unchecked authority? That's the deeper consequence, the one that extends beyond a single interaction. It forces reflection, and reflection isn't always comfortable. It requires honesty, the kind that doesn't allow excuses or easy explanations. He couldn't blame the situation or the environment or even the pace of his work. The choice had been his. The action had been his. And now, the responsibility was his as well. Accountability means facing that without deflection, without trying to minimize what happened or shift the focus somewhere else. It means recognizing the impact, even if it wasn't intended, even if it was built on habit rather than malice. The moment demanded that level of recognition, whether he was ready for it or not. And in that space, between realization and response, he stood without the certainty he once had, forced to confront the gap between who he believed he was and what his actions had revealed. What stays after everything shifts is not the moment itself, but what it reveals. Not just about one person, but about how easily perception can take the place of truth when it's left unchecked. Respect isn't something that appears automatically with a title or a position. It's built through awareness, through the willingness to see people as they are rather than as they seem at a glance. In that space, where assumptions had once guided every decision, something else begins to take form. A recognition that surface-level judgments are incomplete, that they say more about the person making them than the person receiving them. Bias doesn't always show up loudly. It doesn't always declare itself in obvious ways. Often, it hides in routine, in quick decisions, in moments that feel too small to question. That's what makes it dangerous. It blends into everyday behavior, shaping actions without demanding attention. And when it goes unnoticed for long enough, it starts to feel normal, even justified. But moments like this interrupt that pattern. They force a pause, a break in the automatic thinking that usually goes unchallenged. Respect begins in that pause. It starts when someone chooses to question their first instinct instead of acting on it, when they recognize that what they see isn't always the full picture. It requires effort, a conscious decision to move beyond assumption and toward understanding. That doesn't mean hesitation in every situation or doubt in every action. It means balance, the ability to act with awareness rather than impulse. In his case, that balance had been missing. He relied on speed, on certainty, on the belief that his judgment was enough. But judgment without reflection is incomplete. It lacks depth, lacks fairness, lacks the ability to adapt when new information appears. The lesson isn't just about avoiding mistakes. It's about changing the way those mistakes become possible in the first place. It's about recognizing patterns before they repeat, understanding how bias forms, and how it influences behavior over time. Everyone carries some form of bias. It's shaped by experience, by environment, by what is seen and reinforced over time. The difference lies in whether it's acknowledged or ignored. When it's ignored, it grows stronger, more automatic, more difficult to challenge. When it's acknowledged, it can be examined, adjusted, reduced. That process isn't immediate. It takes time, attention, and a willingness to be uncomfortable. Because confronting bias means confronting parts of yourself that don't align with who you believe you are. It means accepting that good intentions don't always lead to fair actions. Respect grows from that honesty. It's not about perfection or never making a wrong judgment. It's about what happens after, how quickly someone recognizes the mistake, how willing they are to correct it, how committed they are to doing better next time. In that sense, respect becomes active rather than passive. It's something practiced, not assumed. It shows in the questions someone asks before making a decision, in the space they give others to define themselves, in the restraint they show when certainty feels easy but understanding requires more effort. The moment with her forced that shift into view. It exposed the gap between perception and reality, between assumption and truth. And once that gap is seen, it can't be unseen. It changes how future moments are approached, how quickly judgments are made, how carefully authority is used. It creates a new awareness, one that lingers beyond the situation itself, not as a reminder of failure, but as a guide for something better, a way of moving forward that values clarity over assumption, that replaces automatic thinking with intentional understanding, that treats every person as more than the first impression they give.